So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Dan Jennis. I'm the Acting Education and Programming Coordinator at the Huron County Museum and Historic Vale. I'd like to welcome you to this virtual presentation of Lake Huron's Beaches and Dunes by Daniela Clisper of the Lake Huron Centre for Coastal Conservation. This presentation connects very well with our new exhibit at the museum called Ripple Effect, which is all about Lake Huron's, Huron County's lakes and waterways. It is called Ripple Effect because the exhibit highlights the idea that what was done before affects us today, and what we do tomorrow will continue to affect the health and future of our waterways. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land we know today as Huron County is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Neutral peoples. We recognize the First Peoples' continued stewardship of the land and water, and that this territory was subject to the dish with one spoon wampum, under which multiple nations agreed to care for the land and resources by the Great Lakes in peace. We would also like to acknowledge and recognize the Upper Canada treaties signed with regards to the land, which include Treaty 29, Treaty 45.5, and our roles as treaty people committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation, gratitude, and respect with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. Before I turn it over to Daniela, I'll go over a few technical items. This is a Zoom meeting, so you can turn on both your microphone and camera on and off, although I ask you to remain muted for most of the presentation. If anyone has any questions at any time, including technical problems, please type them in the chat and I'll be monitoring that throughout. And speaking of which, the weakest link of any virtual presentation is the internet connection. So if your screen keeps freezing, try exiting and re-entering. And if the problem is on our end, we'll do our best to quickly resolve the issue. So now I'm going to turn it over to Daniela. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Danielle Clisper. As Daniel mentioned, I work as the Coastal Stewardship Coordinator at the Lake Huron Centre for Coastal Conservation. I'm joining you today from my home office in Goderich to tell you a little bit about the Lake Huron's beaches and dunes as an ecosystem. So I am also going to turn off my video right now because I've been having some slower internet, and then for the Q&A, I will turn that back on. So for those not familiar, the Lake Huron Centre for Coastal Conservation was founded in 1998 with the goals of protecting and restoring Lake Huron's coastal environment. We are a non-government, not-for-profit charitable organization, and we have a small but mighty team of 4 staff, all of which are based out of Goderich, and so is the organization. Our work focuses on Lake Huron related issues. Some of the programs that we run include shoreline cleanups, beach and dune restoration, community workshops. We have a new youth program that's in its 2nd year, and we have a lot of other initiatives. So you can visit our website at lakehuron.ca for more information. And free educational opportunities such as this one today is brought to you by some of our generous funding from our sponsors that are listed here, and also in collaboration with the Huron County Museum. So to start with the lake, our lake's deepest point is about 750 feet. So that's that dark blue color on this map here. We have a shoreline of about over 6,000 kilometers, and that's including all the islands, making Lake Huron the 2nd largest Great Lake. The lake also has a residence time of 22 years. So that means if it were to become seriously contaminated, it would take about 22 years for the lake to recharge or replace its water. So in comparison, Lake Superior has a residence time of 191 years, and Lake Erie, our smallest lake, has a residence time of 2.6 years. So huge difference there. And that just goes to show the importance of reducing human inputs and impacts because of the long-term impacts that they can have on our lake's health. So when we think of the Lake Huron shoreline, it might conjure up images of sandy beaches and serene, gentle waves lapping on the shoreline, or it might make you think of the powerful storms and waves that crash into the bedrock or the bluff shores. Our shoreline is a complex web of interacting features of natural processes and various ecological communities, and they all provide us with that rich diversity of life and ecosystem services, which are benefits to us that we can all enjoy. So there's about 10 different types of ecosystems, and that includes our famous sand beaches and dunes and those turquoise nearshore waters that we all love. All of these ecosystems are limited in size, and they're under increasing pressure from human interaction, human development, which I'll get into a little bit later as well. So today I want to focus on the sand beach and dune ecosystem, and I want to do that because of its vulnerability to disturbance. Lake Huron's dunes are found along only 2 to 3% of the lake's shoreline, and yet these are the areas of the lakeshore that attract thousands of people each summer for the leisure, the recreation, and so it places them under a lot of pressure. And we see that here in Goderich, Grand Bend, Southampton, Sauble, and all the way up into the Georgian Bay into the Wasaga Beach area. So some of the major dune systems that we see on our Canadian side, which I just mentioned a few, but if we look to the north, on Manitoulin Island, for example, we have Providence Bay, which some of us may have been to, Wasaga Bay or Nottawasaga Bay, which includes Wasaga Beach. And then in the south, we have examples like the Sauble Beach dune system. And then south of us here in Goderich, we have the Grand Bend Pinery Provincial Park and the Ipperwash beach and dune systems. Some of these dune systems are considered to be what we call relic sand deposits, which were formed by geological processes millennia ago. This makes it a finite resource, the sand a finite resource, and it places a greater sense of urgency and need to have proper beach care or stewardship to maintain the health of these ecosystems. So the beaches that we see in Bruce County and in Georgian Bay, and also into the southern shores of Manitoulin, are all called relic beach deposits. So that condition that formed these beaches no longer exists. And as a result, these beaches are vulnerable to that erosion and to loss of sand over the longer term. Whereas when you look at the beaches south of Point Clark, those tend to have a larger supply of sand that can still replenish the beach. So when we think of the eroding bluffs along our areas, those are actually feeding some of our beaches in this area, along with, you can get some sand and sediment deposition coming from major river mouths as well, but the bluffs in our area are a huge part in how much sand we have to replenish our beaches. So here's a general profile of a beach and dune system. The dune, the beach, and the sandbars underwater all act as one unit. So we tend to think of them as separate features, but they actually all work together. So during a storm, especially during the fall and the spring seasons, the waves erode the sand from the dune. So if we're looking at this area of the diagram right here, and that sand gets carried off into the lake to build up these sandbars. And these sandbars underwater are almost like speed bumps that help to diminish the wave energy and lessen the amount of erosion forces on the beach. So this is kind of how the beach protects itself. And then in the calm lake season, such as the summer, gentler waves can carry that sand back to the beach and to the dunes to complete the cycle. So if the dunes or the dune vegetation is compromised in this area, that wind-blown sand can get carried beyond the beach system and be almost unrecoverable for future high lake levels or storms. So a dune is essentially a mound or a berm of sand that's been formed by the wind blowing the sand inland across the beach until an obstacle like the vegetation causes that sand to be deposited. And it's important to note the beach and dune system relies on change, and that change is created by the wind and the waves. If that cycle is disrupted, then those beautiful sandy beaches can erode or degrade over time. So the driving forces, the wind and the waves, are those primary energy sources that are shaping our shore. The force of the waves is a result of three things: the wind speed, something that we call the fetch, which is the distance that the wind blows over the water, and the duration, so how long that wind is blowing for. So most of us may know that during the fall and the winter, fall, winter, and spring, our predominant wind direction is from the northwest. These are also our strongest winds and our strongest wave events because of that long open water, that the wind has to travel to reach most of our Canadian shoreline. And then our summer wind typically comes from the southwest and tends to be of lower energy. So this diagram just shows the differences between our predominant winds. And it's not always the case, but the general trend follows this. So those wind and wave energy events can move a large amount of sand and other sediment. And for those that have been around during those events or have a property or go to a cottage during the fall and the spring, you might see some of these intense storms that hit our shoreline. So this brings me to what we call a highway in the waters that are close to the shore, and we call that the longshore transport. And it's the movement of sand, sediment, and even garbage fragments along the coastline in the shallower nearshore waters. So the nearshore is anything kind of up to that 30-meter mark in the water. So in Lake Huron, the general flow of this longshore transport is from the north to the south, and there are exceptions where it goes from the south to the north, and that's around major river mouths and certain points. So around Point Clark, there's a little bit of a switch there as well for a bit. So that sediment moves along the shoreline almost in like a conveyor belt. And if that conveyor belt is cut off or altered by any structures that are built into the water, so I'm thinking of steel walls or concrete docks or groins, it can have serious effects like causing gradual loss of sand and sediment to certain beaches that are downdrift of these structures. So that can potentially cause erosion downdrift. So as an example, and I mentioned this before, the bluffs north and south of Goderich are naturally eroding away, and they're adding sediment to the lake and eventually feeding beaches south of those bluffs to communities south of us. So Grand Bend beaches, Zipperwash, Pinery Provincial Parks get a lot of sediment that's coming from our area up here. So we're being good neighbors for them. And we're essentially feeding some of those beaches. So it kind of shows the importance of working together as a community to protect the shoreline, and that means the investments on the shoreline, be it property structures, ecosystems on the shoreline, and also for clean water for all of us to enjoy. So to bring it back home in Goderich, we have the groin, the pier, and the boardwalk, the breakwalls, sorry, and those all act as a bit of a barrier and can catch some of that sand that's moving from the north to the south. So the north Marina Beach, where the circle is here, actually gets a lot of sand from the eroding bluffs north of it, and north bluffs and banks, sorry, that are north of it, and that forms what we call a fillet beach here. It's in the shape of a fish fillet almost, and that has a lot to do with the river mouth, but also the structures that have been historically put in place here. And lake levels will also influence how much sand is on our shorelines. So here's an area on Bruce Beach in Bruce County of the same location under both high and low water levels. So in 1986, with our record high at the time, we had eroding dunes and a narrow beach, and you can kind of look at the boathouse here for comparison. And then in 2005, with lower water, we see a wider beach and the dunes rebuilding themselves towards the lake. So the sand beach and dune formation is very much connected to our water levels. Native dune vegetation significantly influences the size and the stability of the dune areas. So if the dunes and the vegetation are removed for a view, for parking lots or property structures or developments, that wind blow sand can be easily carried away onto streets and sidewalks And it can also pile up in front of buildings and need to be shoveled away in order to get into the buildings. We've seen that a little bit happen a little bit as well. And typically the sand that's blown away is that fine-grained, high-quality sand that we all love on the beach, including our tourists. And without the native vegetation, like those native beach grasses, our beach grasses can become very coarse, lowered in profile, and potentially degraded over time. So here's a nice little diagram. This was newly planted marram grass. And you can see where it's trapping a lot of that softer, lighter, fine-grained sand. So back to vegetation. On beaches, it not only helps stabilize the soil, but it can also help to protect the shoreline from wave impacts during those big storms. The importance of a native vegetation buffer between property structures and the water can't be repeated enough, since it's kind of the first line of defense during a lot of storms. Sand dunes contain an impressive amount of diversity of plants. This vegetation can also absorb excess water and slow surface water runoffs, which can also, if there's a lot of water running off on the surface, can impact and influence more erosion. And the vegetation can also filter contaminants and nutrients out of that storm water that's heading to the lake. So potential for reducing algal bloom outbreaks as well. And of course, habitat for wildlife. So many shorebirds rely on the processes that these waves can bring up. So when waves deposit certain biotic material, it can provide a lot of good foraging for insects like this cute piping plover that we have in the photo here. And here's a cross section of a beach and dune vegetation, ecological vegetation succession. So typically at the start of the beach, we have our American beach grass, or what we call marram grass, starting. So it's kind of the colonizer of the beach. It's very tolerant of being buried by sand, and it's very drought tolerant. And then as we move inland, we start to see other plants like the beach pea and wormwood, and other various grasses like the big blue stem and little blue stem. And then we get into, sometimes you'll see this a bit of a depression or a swale, and you start to see other plants in there. And then you get into your second dune, your more mature dune, and that's where you'll see the mature trees develop, and various shrubs there as well. And a really good example of this is Pinery Provincial Park. If you've been there or have a chance to go there, lots of great example of that succession of plants. So that the most common type of grass that we find on dunes and on beaches is called marram grass, or American beach grass. It can grow roots that are up to 3 meters long, stabilizing that sand and again, slowing down the erosion. It's cost effective. So we use this plant a lot for transplanting and in our restoration projects. It doesn't need a lot of water. It tolerates being buried by sand, and it's drought tolerant. So this is a great plant to try to reestablish on your shores. And it helps improve lake water quality. So again, without them, we can start to see lower beach profiles, which can lead to wet beaches. And wet beaches can create ideal conditions for bacteria. And on the bottom here, you can see pictured a growth pattern of the marram grass. So it has a parent plant, and then it colonizes by spreading by rhizomes and creating new plants. So it's a very great obstacle to trap that sand, and it's a great native plant that we have. And we actually have it right here in Goderich as well. So if you head down to the Goderich Cove beach, there's about 3 sections there of native marram grass that were planted a while ago now, but there's lots of very healthy grasses there with lots of great seed heads. So a really good example to see the next time you're out for a walk at the Cove in Goderich. And our youth program is actually helping to try to restore another section of the Goderich beach, with the help of the town of Goderich. So by the beach hut, we have the swing set here looking from the pier to the beach hut, and there's a section here that our youth program was replanting. And if you have a chance to go back there over the summer, you'll actually see some of these grasses coming up. And what we've also had is a lot of pollinator-friendly plants growing there as well, common milkweeds, which are great for the monarch butterfly populations. So our beaches and dunes are important habitat and nesting grounds for a lot of wildlife and a lot of plant species. And some of those are also species at risk. So species at risk are animals or plants whose populations are at risk from habitat destruction, urbanization, pesticides, and many other things. And Ontario does have legislation called the Endangered Species Act, and it aims to protect these vulnerable populations. So some of the examples of species that we have on Lake Huron, the famous piping plover, the pitcher's thistle, and the monarch butterfly. And there's many others along the shoreline that we work to protect, but these are just some of the 3 that we're focusing our efforts right now with our shoreline restoration program. So you might be a resident of Goderich, or you might be visiting for a day or vacationing from elsewhere, but each one of our daily actions can influence and impact the health of the beach. So I just want to go through a few points as to why we should care about the sand beaches and dunes. The sand beaches and dunes provide shoreline communities with a number of important benefits. We call those ecosystem services. They can help protect the shore and properties from those storms, potential flooding, and provide resilience from the impacts of a changing climate. So we're seeing higher wind speeds during our storms. We're seeing more intense storms. Our sand dunes can also help keep that high quality sand on the beach. So I mentioned that fine grained sand that's soft to the touch when we're walking on the beach. They can help filter those contaminants from runoff before they enter the lake. And they can also provide the habitat for many rare plants and wildlife like the monarch butterfly. And some studies have even shown that a healthy sand beach and dune ecosystem can increase property values. A mature dune was valued at $3,000 Canadian per linear meter for its services or its benefits of shore protection, of water filtration, and the sand drifting prevention. Lake Huron is also the drinking water source for around 3 million people, so that's both in Canada and the United States combined. Many of our coastal communities rely on water from our lake, including many First Nation and Métis communities whose water treatment plants source water from the lake. But they're not necessarily on this diagram here, but the diagram shows some of the major communities and cities right on the lake. And there's even inland cities that rely on the lake, on the Great Lake. For example, London, Ontario sources around 80% of its drinking water from Lake Huron through a pipeline that's actually just north of Grand Bend. And I always like to come back to this because I think it is important to think about the ways that we value our waterways around us and how those shape our lifestyle and our daily actions. Many of the Lake Huron and Georgian Bay ecosystems, especially our beaches, experience that flux in recreation and tourism during those summer months. And in most cases, that tourism boost contributes to the local economy. In our experience, tourism and conservation are not mutually exclusive. And we think a healthy functioning system helps to reduce the stress on the shoreline, making it more resilient to that increased usage and preserving the shoreline quality for the long term. Unfortunately, there are many threats to our beach and dune ecosystems. A few of them include that increased shoreline development and more people moving to the same coast here. Invasive species, which I'll mention a few in a couple slides in a second. Motorized vehicles and excessive raking, which can damage the beach. And of course, garbage and plastic pollution along the shoreline. And that can cause entanglement of wildlife. It can be consumed by wildlife, and that can lead to either malnutrition or even death of the animal in the most extreme cases. And an additional stressor to our ecosystem is that of a changing climate. So that's creating a new range of environmental conditions for us to work with now as warming waters reduce the temperatures between the land and the water, our atmosphere becomes more turbulent and stronger wind speeds can occur. So like we learned earlier, wind speed plays a big role in the formation and the reformation of sand beaches and dunes. That surface erosion will likely be very impacted if we continue to see increased wind speeds and increased storms. So stewardship measures that can help build up our natural environment along the shoreline are going to make our coast more adaptable and resilient to meeting those changes ahead. Dunes are what we say your insurance policy for the next high water level period. So right now we see that our water level decreased a little bit this year and is below last year, although still above our average. So we'll have to see what happens over the next winter in terms of the trend of our water levels. So what can you do to help keep beach and dune healthy? If you're planning a visit to the beach, perhaps you can plan a low waste visit. You can bring reusable items such as your cutlery, plates, and cups. And remember to take your garbage home with you, especially those larger items, or dispose of them properly. A lot of the time during our busy seasons, during the summer, with lots of people visiting the beach, our waste can unintentionally escape the garbage and recycling bins. So if you see that those bins are full, perhaps taking your garbage to the next bin or back home with you, as opposed to setting it aside the bin. A lot of the times the wind can pick that up and take it along the shoreline and eventually into the water, into Lake Huron. And you can also sometimes we get to a point where we have to let the town or the city know that waste bins are full a lot faster because of the busy seasons. And hopefully the more folks mention this, it can be a push for either adding more bins at the shoreline or for more frequent changing of the bins and the garbage. Beach cleanups and removing plastic and litter from the dunes can help prevent that entanglement and the consumption by wildlife, and it can also reduce the potential for human safety risks. A lot of the times we have random objects that can be deposited on the shoreline after a storm event that can pose a safety risk to either children or folks at the shoreline. So if you're interested in helping out in this way, joining a local cleanup or doing a solo or even a household style beach cleanup on your weekly or daily beach visits, anytime you go to the beach really, every little bit helps keep that garbage in its place rather than in the water or on the beach. The Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup is a national organization that collects data about what we find during our cleanups. So each year they come out with a dirty dozen, and we continue to see these as the main culprits of the beach. So cigarette butts are almost always number one. We then see tiny pieces of plastics or foam, broken up foam, wrapping up food wrappers, bottle caps, and we're starting to see a lot more balloons, unfortunately. So that's something that's becoming on the radar, I guess, of both their organization and ours here in Goderich as well. Another way that we can help, getting to know the plants at the shore. That's the first step to knowing what is native, non-native, or even invasive. So native plants have adapted to our local conditions, and they provide that habitat for wildlife, insects, birds, but they also provide that great stabilization. So if you take a look here at the difference in the root lengths between our fescue turf grass and our Native American beach grass, which the other name for that was the marram grass. If we think about which one would hold the sand better, if you guessed the American beach grass, then you're correct. Its long root system is a powerful, powerful stabilizer of the dunes and the sand. These native plants also require fewer inputs of water, fertilizers, and pesticides, so they're very adapted to our shoreline. So if you do see or have any turf grass on or close to the beaches, some of the times you can even notice that it attracts geese onto your shoreline, which can produce waste on the beach. So we do advise to try to slowly switch to alternatives such as the American beach grass. Little blue stem is another great one. And if you have any specific questions about vegetation, you can feel free to ask at the end here today, or even email us as well. So grooming your pet, not your beach. And by this, I am referring to mechanical beach grooming, which is extremely damaging to our beach environments. It can loosen the sand, causing it to blow off the beach. And it can even lead to a wet beach, which is not desirable for laying out our towels. So if you must pick up debris, whether that's natural or unnatural, stuff that washes up, the best way to do it is by hand and with volunteers. So that's why we try to really focus on our shoreline cleanups. During non-COVID years, we would have been hosting one over this last spring, but we're hoping that perhaps we'll be able to hold a fall cleanup this year, again, depending on the COVID rules. So if you're interested in volunteering for something like that, feel free to keep checking on our website and our social media, and we would be advertising in the radio and in the newspaper as well. So keeping your eyes open and ears as well for that information. And so this kind of bounces off the last point, but using vehicles or heavy machinery on beaches and dunes can also be damaging to the ecology and the landscape. A lot of the species use these areas for, a lot of bird and wildlife species use these areas as habitat, and it can be harmed when vehicles are in that area. So the weight of a vehicle, of a motorized vehicle, can compact the sand, making it difficult for vegetation to grow. Vehicles can also kill native beach plants with a single pass, and even with those wide flotation tires of quad bikes, those can crush plants as well. So most communities and towns will have designated trails for both ATVs and for snowmobiles that can be also more fun to ride. And so when we talk about invasive species, I mentioned it a little bit before, but new plants or bugs can be introduced to beaches accidentally. That can happen through boats and ATVs that have not been properly washed, or they could have escaped from our gardens. Certain plants are definitely culprits of escaping via wind dispersal. And these plants and bugs can become invasive and outcompete certain native species because they don't have anything targeting them or eating them. So an extreme example of that is the Phragmites australis, the common reed grass, which is right here in the middle. It has led to significant impacts on financial values of beachfront properties and on ecosystem health of beaches and dunes. So there's been lots of work along the shoreline north of us to try to eradicate Phragmites because it does alter a beach and dune ecosystem very significantly. So learning how to identify these plants and remove them is very important for protecting those coastal environments. Most of these you can remove by hand pulling or spading, and there are certain instances where we've had to bring in specialized equipment for Phragmites just because of the extent that it had taken over certain areas. So what else can we do? Keeping things natural on the shorelines. If you have a cottage or live near the shore, keeping that as natural as possible, unless you're protecting critical infrastructure on your shore. But a lot of hardened shorelines, seawalls, armor stones, concrete, that kind of stuff tends to be less effective and more expensive in the long run than having a natural dune shoreline at the property. Slowing that surface water runoff. So I mentioned this a little bit before, but anything from rain gardens, rain diversion, or rain harvesting can help soak up the excessive water that would otherwise be going through the dune system and potentially eroding banks away. Sizing up your dunes. So when we work with property owners, we tend to say dunes should be about that 15-meter mark wide from the lake to the water. And those are best for protecting during high water levels, protection from storms. And of course, for those that live or visit or have a property at the shoreline, knowing before you build. So there's a lot of dynamic beach zones, so contacting your conservation authorities like the Maitland Valley, who had spoke before on this webinar series, and the Ausable Bayfield Conservation Authorities are great organizations to contact about that. And of course, the one that I didn't put on here is working with your community. So kind of mentioned that during volunteer opportunities, but a lot of the times there's organizations within your community that are looking for volunteers. In Goderich, we have even an organization such as Green Goderich. And there's a lot of other sustainability related and restoration related organizations in our communities where we can help and volunteer and provide some help in that way. So we as the Coastal Centre actively work with municipalities and local community groups in planning better ways to care for our coastal environment. Our website is www.lakehuron.ca, and we have a ton of great resources, and you can learn about some of the programs that we offer as well. And just one last note, we do have a webinar series, a free webinar series as well. The next webinar is coming up on August 10th, and it's going to be about shorebirds that you can find on the Lake Huron shoreline, and that will also be recorded and posted online. And all of these previous ones have been recorded. So if there's one that strikes interest, for example, coastal plants or living shorelines, or even the plastic webinar, that is all available online if you would like an evening watch. So once again, I would like to thank and show our appreciation for the generous funding from our Beach and Dune program sponsors. These events would not be possible without the support of these organizations and individuals like yourself. If you'd like to make a donation to our programs, you can definitely visit our website at lakehuron.ca or give us a call. And so with that, I'll wrap it up, and thank you very much for listening.